The recent news that the World Health Organization declared aspartame as a possible human carcinogen has a lot of people online posting content either telling you to completely avoid aspartame,
Remove artificial sweeteners.
or on the other side, there are influencers that are posting content telling you,
There is zero evidence that aspartame poses a risk to human health.
don't worry about it, aspartame's completely safe. The amount of aspartame that you would need to consume to see a carcinogenic effect is way more than you would be consuming on a daily basis, even if you had like 12 cans of Diet Coke per day. And so this brings up a really big question for most of us, and that is, how do we know what science to trust, especially because the FDA is actually disagreeing with what the WHO is saying. So the FDA is sticking to their guns and saying that aspartame is safe to consume. And so what are we to make of this? How are we to interpret this information, two conflicting statements? So I found a clip online by this YouTuber named Bart K, and he gives us a pretty good example of why it's hard to determine if a single ingredient is beneficial for us or if it hurts us in any way.
Of course, the problem then becomes to do a controlled study on cancer and red meat. What we have to do is take sets of genetically identical twins separated at birth, locked in separate labs at birth, treated exactly the same way in every respect, except for the intake of red meat for their entire lives, and see whether there's a higher incidence of cancer in the people who get the red meat as opposed to the ones that don't. The problems here are ethics. You can't do experiments on human beings. Two, how do you get people to agree to spend their entire life locked in a lab? And how do you get large enough numbers of genetically identical twins to do that in order to do such a study? Where do you get the money to do that from? And who's going to look after that study for the lifespan of? This is just never, ever going to happen.
So in this case, he is talking about eating red meat and how you would need to design a study to determine if red meat indeed causes cancer. So similarly, it's extremely difficult to prove that any environmental toxin, food ingredient, pesticide, or other factor causes cancer. So what can we make out of this? In the end, we have to decide for ourselves what we choose to put into our bodies. And while the example that Bart K gives is extreme, I think it's really valuable for us to examine it, listen to it, to process it, especially those of us who are not well versed in science. We really need to consume this information to hear this side of the story and decide whether or not we want to feed these things to ourselves or to our children or to our loved ones, really, especially on a daily basis. So keeping that in mind, it's always important to make an educated decision to decide how many of these potentially harmful ingredients we're exposed to on a daily basis and how many we choose not to expose ourselves to.